Before the applause had even finished, she had already made her first mistake. She didn't know that yet, of course. Nobody in that room knew it except one person, and that person was standing very quietly near the back wall, holding a glass of sparkling water she hadn't touched, watching everything with the kind of patience that only comes from years of learning how to wait. But we'll get to that. Welcome to Ivory Secrets. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button and leave a comment telling us what city you're watching from. We have viewers tuning in from Vancouver, Toronto, Calgary, Edmonton. We love seeing where you're all watching from. Now settle in, because this one is going to stay with. The product launch was held at the Hartwell Center in downtown Ottawa on a Thursday evening in late October. The kind of night where the air smells like wet leaves and cold stone, and the city feels like it's holding its breath before winter finally arrives. The venue had been chosen carefully. Neutral territory, impressive without being ostentatious. The sort of place that said we have taste rather than we have money. Though the distinction was largely cosmetic, the people in that room had both. Brendan Whitfield had booked the venue 6 weeks earlier, which was, his assistant would later note, almost exactly the same week he had stopped wearing his wedding ring. He was 44 years old and had spent the better part of advisory group building two-person advisory group, from a two-person consultancy operating out of a sublease on Sparks Street into one of the more quietly influential advisory firms in the National Capital Region. So, he was not famous in the way that tech founders or politicians are famous, but he was known in the way that matters in certain rooms, the way a name on a guest list makes a maitre d' straighten slightly, the way a returned phone call arrives faster than it otherwise might. He had built that quietly, methodically, and with considerable help from the Montague family, whose eldest daughter he had married 17 years ago. Her name was Annalise Montague-Whitfield. She was 41, and she was standing near the back wall with her sparkling water, and she had not touched it. The woman who had made the mistake was named Daphne Croft. She was 36, polished in the specific way that people who work very hard at appearing effortless are polished, and she had been introduced to the assembled guests that evening as Brendan's new strategic partner and co-director of operations, a title that had appeared on no company documents prior to that evening, a fact that two people in the room had already quietly noted. She wore a dress the color of champagne, which may or may not have been intentional, and when Brendan led her to the front of the room to make the announcement, she placed her hand on his arm in a way that was not quite professional and not quite personal, but existed in the deliberate space between the two. The room noticed. Rooms always notice. What Daphne had not understood, what she had perhaps never bothered to learn, because some people move through the world assuming the ground will hold, was that the Montague family did not simply have money. The Montague family was money in the way that certain institutions simply are what they are. Foundational, structural, the kind of presence that doesn't announce itself because it doesn't need to. Annalise's father, Robert Montague, had spent 40 years building a private equity network that touched nearly every significant commercial real estate deal in eastern Ontario and western Quebec. Her mother, Catherine, sat on the boards of 3 foundations and had quietly funded the careers of more judges, city councilors, and crown attorneys than anyone had ever bothered to count. Her brother, Malcolm, ran the family's legal and financial operations with the same mild-mannered precision their father had modeled, the kind of man who spoke softly in meetings and whose suggestions were always, somehow, adopted unanimously. They were not a family that made scenes. They were a family that made decisions. Annalise had called her brother the morning after she found the messages on Brendan's phone, not to cry, not to rage, but to say, very calmly, "I need you to look into the structure of Cornerstone, quietly, all of it." And Malcolm, who had always understood his sister in the particular way that certain siblings understand each other, had said, "Give me 2 weeks." And then he had paused and added, "Are you all right?" And Annalise had said, "I will be." Which was not the same thing as yes, but it was the truth, which is what she always offered when she had it. That had been 6 weeks ago. The same 6 weeks during which Brendan had stopped wearing his ring. The evening had been orchestrated to feel spontaneous. That was the tell. if you knew what to look for. The lighting was too good, the catering too precisely timed, the guest list too curated for it to be anything other than a production. Brendan had invited clients, colleagues, a handful of journalists from business publications, and several people from Ottawa's social circuit whose presence conferred legitimacy in ways that were difficult to quantify, but immediately felt he had not invited Annalise. She had come anyway. This was her first departure from the script he had been writing, and it unsettled him in a way he didn't show. Because Brendan Whitfield was also a person who had learned how to manage his expression in rooms full of people. When he saw her near the back, he felt something shift in his chest. Not guilt, exactly, or not only guilt, but something closer to the recognition that a situation he had believed was under his control was perhaps more complicated than he had allowed himself to believe. He recovered quickly. He was good at that. What he didn't recover quickly enough to notice was that Annalise had not come alone. She had come with her father. Robert Montague was 71 years old and had the kind of physical stillness that very powerful people sometimes develop. Not the stillness of someone who is passive, but the stillness of someone who has long since stopped needing to prove anything through motion. He was standing slightly behind Annalise and, to her left, speaking quietly, with a man named Daniel Osei, who happened to be one of Cornerstone's 3 largest institutional clients. They were talking about hockey. To all outward appearances, they had been talking about hockey for approximately 4 minutes. Annalise watched Daphne laugh at something. Brendan said near the presentation table. She watched the way Daphne touched the display materials, the branded folders, the framed vision statement that Annalise recognized as something she and Brendan had drafted together on a rainy Sunday afternoon 3 years ago. She watched Daphne pick up one of those folders and hand it to a guest with the easy confidence of someone who believed this was her room now. Annalise took a sip of her sparkling water. She was patient. She had learned patience the same way most people learn it, by having no other choice for long enough that it stops feeling like a limitation and starts feeling like a tool. The announcement came at 8:15. Brendan took the microphone with the practiced ease of someone who had given many presentations and enjoyed giving them, the kind of person who fills a room not through volume, but through the particular quality of his attention, the way he made each person feel, for a moment, that they were the most important person he was speaking to. He spoke about Cornerstone's growth. He spoke about the next phase of expansion, about new markets, about strategic vision. He used the word partnership 4 times, and the 4th time he gestured toward Daphne, who stepped forward with a smile calibrated to project both capability and warmth, and the room applauded. Not enthusiastically, but politely. Because these were professional people, and professional people applaud at launches. And then Brendan said, "I'm also pleased to share that Daphne will be joining me in a personal capacity as well as a professional one." The room went very quiet. Not the quiet of shock, exactly. More the quiet of recalibration, of a room full of people simultaneously adjusting their understanding of what kind of evening this actually was. Daphne smiled. It was a very specific kind of smile. The smile of someone who has been waiting a long time to stand in front of exactly this audience and be exactly this person. She had imagined this moment, you could tell. What she hadn't imagined was the sound of the door at the far end of the room opening, not a dramatic sound. Just the ordinary sound of a door, a brief admission of cold October air, and then the quiet footsteps of Malcolm Montague, who had apparently been delayed and was only now arriving. He was accompanied by a woman named Priya Sahota, who was a senior partner at the firm that managed the Montague family's legal affairs, and a younger man carrying a leather document case, whom nobody recognized, but who several people in the room would later describe, without being able to explain exactly why, as someone who looked very much like he was there to do something specific. Malcolm Montague was 45 years old, and dressed like he was attending a board meeting, which in a functional sense he was. He nodded at his sister. He nodded at his father. He looked at Brendan with the particular expression of a person who has read a great many documents over the past 6 weeks and found them, collectively, illuminating. He did not look at Daphne at all. Here is what most people in that room did not know, and what a few of them were about to begin understanding. Cornerstone Advisory Group had been built on a foundation that included, at several critical junctures, capital from the Montague family's holding companies. Not in ways that were obvious from the outside. The structure had been designed, at Brendan's request, to preserve his public image as a self-made entrepreneur, and the Montague family had agreed to this because Annalise had asked them to, and because family support, in that world, did not require acknowledgement to be real. What it did require, it turned out, was a certain set of contractual arrangements that Brendan had signed 17 years ago and had not perhaps reviewed with sufficient attention in the years since. Or perhaps he had simply decided at some point that those arrangements were theoretical, that the relationship they were attached to was permanent, that some structures simply don't come down. Malcolm Montague had spent 6 weeks reviewing those arrangements. Priya Sahota had then spent 3 additional days making several phone calls. The results of those phone calls were, in the document case carried by the young man nobody recognized. Brendan saw Malcolm and felt the temperature in his chest drop several degrees. He was a smart man, genuinely smart, not just successful. And there is a difference. And his mind moved quickly through several scenarios, calculating, adjusting, arriving at the uncomfortable conclusion that he had perhaps miscalculated the nature of what he was doing. He had thought he was leaving a marriage. He had not fully reckoned with the fact that a marriage, in this particular case, was not separable from a set of business relationships that were not his alone to dissolve. He kept his expression pleasant. He thanked the room for coming. He suggested that people help themselves to the bar and the catering, and the room began to move and breathe again. And in the gentle chaos of a cocktail hour resuming, Brendan crossed the room toward Malcolm with the specific walk of a man who wants to appear casual and is not. "Malcolm," he said, "good to see you. I didn't know you were coming. I wasn't sure I'd make it," Malcolm said. "But Priya had some things she wanted to discuss with you, and it seemed like as good a time as any." Priya Sahota stepped forward. She was the kind of person whose competence was immediately apparent in the way she occupied space, the particular quality of her focus. "Mr. Whitfield," she said, "I wonder if we might find somewhere quiet to talk. It shouldn't take long." "It can wait until Monday," Brendan said. "Tonight isn't really. It really can't," Priya said, not unkindly, just precisely. Daniel Osei, who had been speaking with Robert Montague about hockey, and had apparently concluded that conversation materialized at Brendan's elbow. He had a drink in one hand and the expression of a man who has already made a decision, but is extending the courtesy of not stating it yet. "Brendan," he said, "I was hoping we'd get a chance to talk as well, about the Harrington account renewal. The timing has gotten complicated." Brendan looked from Malcolm to Priya to Daniel. He looked across the room to where Annalise was standing, and she was not looking at him. She was talking to a woman he recognized as the head of communications for one of Ottawa's largest development firms, talking with the easy fluency of someone who has known each other a long time, and she was almost smiling. Almost. They found a small conference room off the main hall. It had a long table and bad lighting, and the particular temperature of a room that is used for meetings where things are decided. Brendan sat down because it seemed like the right thing to do. Priya opened the document case. What followed was not, technically, a confrontation. It was a conversation, conducted with the even-tempered professionalism of people who deal with complicated situations for a living and have learned that volume is rarely useful. But over the course of 45 minutes, several things became clear. The Montague family's holding companies held a series of deferred interest positions in Cornerstone that had accrued, over 17 years, to a figure that was considerably larger than Brendan had apparently believed, or perhaps had chosen to believe was still operative. Priya walked him through each one. She had a quality that certain lawyers develop, where she could present information that was essentially catastrophic, with the same neutral delivery she might use to read a grocery list. And Brendan found himself wishing, distantly, that she would raise her voice, because that at least would have given him something to push back against. She did not raise her voice. She also presented 2 letters. The first was from Daniel Osie's firm, indicating that the Harrington account renewal, Cornerstone's largest ongoing contract, representing approximately 31% of annual revenue, would not be proceeding, as previously discussed. The second was from a firm in Montreal, the name of which Brendan recognized as belonging to significant institutional relationship, indicating that they were also reviewing their arrangement. "This is retaliation," Brendan said. It was the first time he'd raised his voice. "This is a business decision," Malcolm said. He was sitting across the table with his hands folded, and the expression of someone who has genuinely nothing to prove. "Several business decisions made independently by parties who have long-standing relationships with our family, and whose trust has always been, in part, an extension of those relationships." "That's not a threat, Brendan. It's just how things work." "Annalise knows about this," Brendan said. "Annalise asked me to review the structure of the company," Malcolm said. The rest followed from that. There was a silence. "What does she want?" Brendan asked. Malcolm looked at him for a moment with something that was not quite pity and not quite contempt, but existed somewhere in that geography. "She wants what she's always wanted," he said. "To be treated like a person who matters. That window has probably closed. So, in practical terms, Priya will be in touch." Out in the main room, the launch was winding down. The catering staff were clearing glasses. A few guests lingered near the bar in the self-sustaining way that parties have, the inertia of a room that hasn't quite decided it's done yet. Robert Montague was saying goodbye to someone near the door. The young man with the document case was gone. Annalise stood near the window with her sparkling water and watched the city below. Ottawa at night in October is a particular kind of beautiful. The Parliament buildings lit in a way that makes them look more permanent than anything has a right to look. The Rideau River just visible if you knew where to look, the cold outside pressing gently against the glass. The woman she'd been talking to, her name was Simone Beauchamp, and she ran community changes for Aldercroft Development, touched her arm before leaving. "Call me," she said. "We'll have lunch." "I'd like that," Annalise said. Daphne was on the other side of the room, standing alone for the first time that evening, and the expression on her face was one that took a moment to identify. It was not quite confusion and not quite fear. It was the expression of someone who has been standing on what they believed was solid ground, and has just noticed, for the first time, a slight give beneath their feet. She was looking the way people look around a room when they're trying to locate the person who can explain to them what just happened. She was looking for Brendan. She couldn't find him because Brendan was still in the conference room with Malcolm and Priya, and would be for some time yet. She made eye contact with Annalise, and it was accidental. And she looked away quickly, and then looked back because sometimes you can't help it. Annalise did not look away. She held Daphne's gaze for exactly the length of time it took to communicate, without any words at all, the thing that Annalise had understood for 6 weeks, and that Daphne was only beginning to understand now, that there are rooms that appear to belong to whoever stands the center of them, and there are rooms that actually belong to someone else entirely. The difference isn't always visible, but it becomes visible. Annalise set down her sparkling water. She still hadn't touched it, picked up her coat from the chair where she'd left it, and walked to where her father was waiting near the door. "Ready?" Robert said. "Yes," she said. They walked out into the October night together, and the cold came up to meet them, sharp and clean, and Annalise pulled her coat around her shoulders and breathed in the autumn air, wet leaves, cold stone, the particular smell of a city, settling into itself. And she felt something she hadn't expected to feel yet. Not triumph, something quieter than that. She had spent 6 weeks being afraid that she wouldn't survive this, that the shape of her life, which had been built in such close proximity to another person's ambitions, would simply collapse when the scaffolding of that proximity was removed. She had lain awake in the house on Cartier Street, her grandmother's house, left to her, in her name, hers alone, and she had listened to the silence of it and tried to figure out whether the silence felt like absence or like something else. Standing outside the Hartwell Center with her father, watching her breath cloud, briefly, in the cold air, She decided it felt like space, room to become again, the version of herself that had existed before she had learned to make herself smaller, so that someone else could feel larger. Her father didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He had driven 4 hours from Kingston for this evening, which was the only language he had ever really needed to use with her. She took his arm and they walked toward the parking garage, and behind them, through the tall glass windows of the Hartwell Center, the last of the launch party was emptying out into the night. By the following Monday, the calls had been made that needed to be made. By the end of the month, 2 more institutional clients had quietly confirmed they would not be renewing. The restructuring process that Priya Sahota had outlined in the conference room moved forward with the same measured, inevitable quality that she brought to everything. Brendan hired a lawyer. His lawyer called Priya. Priya was not particularly surprised by this, and the conversations that followed were conducted with the same professional courtesy that had characterized the entire situation, because the Montague family had never needed volume. They had structure, they had relationship, they had 17 years of deferred interest and an excellent memory for detail. Daphne left the new position, the title that had appeared on no company documents. Within 3 weeks, the circumstances were not discussed publicly. She had arrived at the launch believing she was stepping into a future, and she had left it, stepping into an aftermath, which is what futures sometimes become when they are built on other people's foundations without understanding who those foundations belong to. In November, Annalise had lunch with Simone Beauchamp at a restaurant on Elgin Street, where they had met before years ago, and hadn't in some time. They talked for 3 hours. Simone mentioned a community advisory position that was coming open on the Aldercroft Development Board, cultural liaison working with heritage foundations across the region. It was the kind of work that sounded deceptive until you understood what it actually touched. Annalise said she'd think about it. She had already decided yes. But she had learned over the years the value of taking a moment when you commit to a thing, of sitting inside the decision for a breath or two. Not because you need the time, but because the pause itself is meaningful. A reminder that you are choosing, not simply responding, that there is a difference between the two. Her grandmother had taught her that in the house on Cartier Street, which was hers in her name, hers alone. She thought about her grandmother sometimes, in the early mornings when the house was quiet, and the light came in, sideways through the kitchen window, the way it does in November, cold and particular, and somehow more honest than summer light. Her grandmother had been a woman who did not make scenes, who had survived things. She had survived considerable things by understanding something that Annalise had taken a long time to learn herself, that the loudest thing in a room is not always the most powerful thing in a room. Sometimes the most powerful thing is the thing that waits, the thing that knows, the thing that was there before the noise began and will be there after it ends. On a Tuesday morning in December, Annalise walked into the Aldercroft offices for her first meeting as a board member. She was 41 years old and wore the kind of coat that doesn't need to announce itself. The receptionist offered her coffee. She accepted. She sat down at the table and opened her notebook to a clean page. Outside, the first snow of the season was falling on Ottawa in the quiet, unhurried way that first snow always falls, as if it has all the time in the world, as if it has always been here, as if it intends to stay.